at 4:45 p.m. on the frozen western edge of Greenland, at the perimeter of a U.S.-built airbase now guarded by Danish forces. An unauthorized political chain of command triggered a fast-moving seizure operation, with the odds stacked against every aircraft on the ramp and every radar on the coast. A whiteout front was drifting in from Baffin Bay, the runway lights were already fighting the dusk, and the island's airspace was tightening by the minute under overlapping NATO identification rules. In the first 3 minutes, the threat wasn't bullets, it was confusion, misread authorities, and the kind of fog of law that gets people killed. And the moment the Danish commander hesitated, thinking he still had time to verify higher approval, he made a catastrophic mistake. This is a fictional scenario presented like an urgent operations analysis, built from publicly known systems and realistic constraints, but not describing a real event. The names, orders, and triggers are scenario-based, and the purpose is to show how quickly a cold weather crisis can collapse into escalation when the window closes. 90 seconds into the operation, the base command network went silent in a way that didn't look like weather interference, it looked deliberate. The first open loop was already forming. It wasn't just a seizure of ground. It was a seizure of the air picture, but they didn't see the second layer moving underneath it. What happened in the next 37 minutes became the most dangerous miscalculation in the North Atlantic since the end of the Cold War. In that compressed span, 2 runways were effectively contested, 1 Danish security platoon was pinned without firing first, 6 U.S. Air Force aircraft on the apron were immobilized by a fuel control lockout, 3 radar nodes were blinded by non-kinetic disruption, 8 EU warships surged toward the straight line, 1 transport aircraft diverted with injured personnel aboard, 0 confirmed fatalities occurred, but 14 service members were wounded in crush and cold exposure during the first stampede, 2 facilities burned, and a strategic alliance nearly fractured in under an hour. That's not a headline. That's a chain reaction. And here's the part that matters. The seizure looked clean in minute 5. It looked decisive. And that illusion would produce the first false victory right before everything changed. Greenland is not just ice and distance, it's geometry. From the northwest coast, it's roughly 1,300 nautical miles to the UK and about 700 nautical miles to Iceland, depending on the track, and it sits across the air and sea corridors that tie North America to Europe. In this scenario, the airbase in question is a hardened Arctic node with a long runway capable of supporting heavy transports and tankers, exactly the kind of platform that becomes a lever during a crisis. It has layered security, fenced perimeters, blast-resistant shelters, and a small but critical suite of sensors: air search radar coverage, approach control, and satellite-cued reporting into regional awareness networks. Denmark's local force package on the ground is modest but disciplined, a reinforced security element, winter mobility, and police authority over access control. They're not set up for a battalion assault, but they're set up to delay, record, and call for reinforcement. Under normal conditions, the threat would be a state actor testing the seams. But here, the trigger is political, an internal U.S. directive that's treated as operational. That's how this starts. Not with missiles, but with paperwork moving faster than the snow. The seizure force in this scenario is built around speed and ambiguity. A small team moves first, unmarked but professional, followed by a rapid airlift element timed to the weather gap. Their objective isn't to destroy Denmark's forces, it's to overwhelm the decision cycle, take control of the tower, lock down fuel and comms, and present the world with a new fact on the ground, before anyone can retaliate without looking like the aggressor. But the odds stack early: cold weather hydraulics, runway friction, low ceilings, and one more constraint that nobody on the ground can see yet: EU maritime units already underway for a scheduled exercise that can be repurposed in minutes. The ocean burned with reflected sunset under the cloud deck, and the strait narrowed, not physically, but politically, because the window closed the moment the first armed personnel crossed the inner fence line. Then the radar lit up, not with fighters, with transponders behaving strangely, altitude stepping, tags blinking, returns clustering at the edge of coverage as if someone was baiting the system. That's when everything changed. At 4:49 p.m., 4 minutes after the seizure began, the base's air traffic control console showed a sudden cascade of unknown tracks at low altitude, classic clutter conditions in Arctic weather, except these tracks held shape. They weren't random returns, they were coherent, moving as a package, hugging the terrain contours and timing their appearance to coincide with a communications fault. In the next 90 seconds, the local Danish commander realized the base's primary external link wasn't down. It had been intercepted, functionally severed by a targeted disruption that didn't need explosives to be effective. The seizure team moved the way experienced operators move when they believe the first resistance will be legal, not lethal. They flowed into choke points, took the tower access, locked down the fuel farm controls, and forced the Danish security element into a containment posture without a firefight. The first false victory arrived here, the Danish commander facing a mixed environment of foreign personnel and ambiguous U.S. identifiers hesitated long enough for the base's operational heart to be captured intact. The seizure force broadcast a clean message. The base was under protective control. No shots fired, no warning required, order restored. For 5 minutes, it worked. Because the main danger in Arctic basing is not gunfire, it's aircraft. An airbase is a machine. Fuel, runway clearance, de-icing, tower sequencing, disrupt any piece, and you can immobilize jets without ever pulling a trigger. And at 4:55 p.m., 6 U.S. aircraft, parked, cold-soaked, and half-serviced, became suddenly unavailable. Fuel valves were electronically locked. 2 tractors lost network authorization. The base, still physically intact, went to silent operation, but they didn't see what their own disruption revealed to everyone else, a loss of continuity in NATO side reporting. Once a node drops out, every Allied operations center sees the gap, and gaps create assumptions. Assumptions become deployments. 5 minutes later, exactly as the title promises, EU naval commanders received a rapid tasking change. 8 warships, already in motion for a nearby maritime evolution, were redirected to form a visible deterrent screen. That movement wasn't about firing. It was about proof. Proof that Europe could surge steel into the North Atlantic corridor before any new normal could settle. And then the seizure force made their second mistake. They treated the warships as theater, something that would arrive too late to matter. They didn't see the airspace consequences of an EU surface surge. What happened next was not diplomatic, it was geometric. By 5:02 p.m., the EU screen was forming in segments, using known transit lanes and rendezvous logic. The lead elements weren't battleships. They were modern surface combatants, frigate and destroyer-class hulls with long-range radar, helicopter decks, and layered air defense. Even without launching a single missile, they could reshape the air picture by expanding sensor coverage and shifting the rules of identification in shared corridors. That's the second false victory for the adversary. The seizure team believed they had achieved strategic shock without violence. For a moment, it looked like it. Denmark's local force was contained. The tower was controlled. The base's external messaging was dominated. If you freeze the situation for a screenshot at 5:05 p.m., it looks like a bloodless takeover. But that's not how operational reality works. It's not a photo, it's a clock. At 5:06 p.m., satellite queuing and high-altitude ISR, publicly known capabilities, not classified tactics, began stitching together a clearer picture. When a base goes silent, eyes multiply. When transponders behave strangely, analysts compare the tracks to typical aircraft and drone profiles. When the ground perimeter locks down, someone watches the heat signatures around the fuel farm. In this scenario, those cues flowed fast into U.S. Northern Command-style alert pathways and into NATO coordination channels because the island is the bridge between continents. The seizure force tried to exploit the confusion further. They pushed a perimeter expansion, tightening access roads, controlling the runway ends, and moving personnel toward the hangar line. That decision created the near-failure vector for the U.S. If the runway was fully denied and the aircraft on the ground were captured, the political leverage would become real. A captured airbase is not just terrain, it's hostages, equipment, and alliance humiliation. Then a new track appeared. High, fast, clean, not a civilian call sign, a military profile holding outside the immediate bubble. Then radar picked up a second layer, lower, slower, approaching from a direction that didn't align with normal corridors. That's when the island held. At 5:10 p.m., the seizure force attempted the decisive lock. They moved to seize the base's communications relay room and physically secure the approach radar shack. That's how you cut off the outside world long enough to solidify control. But they underestimated what the Arctic punishes more than bullets: overconfidence. The relay room wasn't empty. It was cold, cramped, and wired for redundancy. And in the scramble to secure it, a crucial safety protocol tripped. Hard. Backup power switched. A fire suppression system discharged in a confined space. Visibility collapsed inside the room, and 2 security personnel went down, not from gunfire, but from oxygen disruption and panic in a sealed corridor. In the same minute, the base's internal emergency alert sounded, audible across the ramp. The seizure team had tried to go silent. Instead, the entire installation heard the alarm. That alarm triggered a cascade. Danish security, already pinned, used the confusion to reposition. A small element broke containment, not to win a firefight, but to reach a secure handset and transmit a location-verified distress call. In cold operations, one verified call is worth more than 100 rumors. It anchored the narrative. This was not a scheduled transfer. This was a contested seizure. Meanwhile, the approaching aircraft made their move. In this scenario, U.S. response planners chose the fastest layered option that stays plausible and publicly known: airborne ISR to confirm electronic warfare in general terms, to complicate hostile coordination, and a quick reaction force insertion timed to weather and runway conditions, and it almost failed. At 5:14 p.m., the first insertion attempt was compromised by the same thing the seizure team thought was their advantage: the weather. Crosswinds spiked. Blowing snow reduced contrast. A tiltrotor profile, an MV-22 Osprey-type asset in this scenario, could not commit to the normal landing zone without risking rotor wash whiteout and brownout-style disorientation on ice. The window closed. The base, still under partial hostile control, was minutes away from total runway denial. Then the seizure force made the catastrophic operational error that turns containment into collapse. They attempted to push a vehicle across the runway threshold to block any landing, assuming it would force negotiation. That move changed the rules, because the moment a runway is physically obstructed during an active crisis, it becomes an imminent hazard, not a political statement. It becomes a threat to life, to aircraft, to the possibility of extraction. It becomes the trigger that justifies force. 90 seconds later, the U.S. counterpunch began, surgical, layered, and overwhelming. At 5:16 p.m., the first step wasn't missiles, it was the air picture. A stealth aircraft profile, F-35 class in this scenario, held outside the base's immediate visual envelope, using sensor fusion to map heat sources, vehicle positions, and movement along the perimeter. The goal wasn't to bomb the base, the goal was to identify the command nodes, who was coordinating, where the comms were, and where the vehicles were staged. At 5:18 p.m., electronic effects began, not described as magic, not described as classified, just the realistic outcome of modern EW and decoy employment. Radios suffered interference, GPS confidence degraded in pockets, and the seizure team's coordination slowed by seconds at a time. Seconds are everything. Overwhelmed isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. And then it collapses. At 5:20 p.m., a second aircraft, a P-8 Poseidon-type maritime patrol platform in this scenario, entered the broader area, not to attack the ground, but to extend ISR and maritime awareness. With EU warships closing and multiple actors converging, preventing misidentification becomes as important as winning the ground fight. The worst outcome would be allies mistaking allies as the ocean burned under low light and stressed sensors. At 5:22 p.m., the Osprey insertion re-attempted, this time not straight onto the runway, but into a sheltered approach corridor identified by ISR as less wind-exposed. The team on board wasn't there to capture the base. They were there to extract control points, tower access, fuel farm control, and the detained Danish commander's location. Extraction is the word that matters, because in a multi-flag environment, you don't want a prolonged firefight. You want a decisive removal of the hostile control layer. At 5:24 p.m., the runway obstruction vehicle became the pivot. Under ISR confirmation, it was disabled in a controlled way. No dramatic explosion required, just enough to clear the hazard and open the landing geometry. That clearance wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. It told everyone on the ground the seizure force cannot hold the runway. Then the seizure team tried to salvage the second false victory. They attempted to retreat into the hangar line, use the base's buildings as cover, and force a standoff. For a moment, it looked like it might work. They had interior positions. They had hostages by proximity. They had the optics of defending a facility. But that's when the layered response closed the net. At 5:27 p.m., a destroyer-class surface combatant off the Greenlandic coast, U.S. Navy in this scenario, provided a coordination anchor, long-range radar, communications relay, and a visible deterrent posture. The purpose wasn't to fire Tomahawk missiles. The purpose was to prevent escalation by making escalation pointless. Retaliatory capability on display without being used. At 5:29 p.m., the quick reaction element reached the tower. The tower is not just a room, it's authority. Whoever controls the tower controls the runway narrative. Within minutes, the hostile personnel inside were isolated, disarmed, and eliminated as a control factor, not necessarily killed, but removed from the decision loop. The base's flight operations could breathe again. At 5:33 p.m., the Danish commander was extracted from containment, medically assessed for cold exposure, and placed back into a secure communications pathway. The seizure force's entire strategy depended on Denmark being silent or confused. That silence was broken, and once Denmark speaks with verified facts, Europe moves from posture to action. At 5:36 p.m., the EU warships reached a point of undeniable visibility in the corridor. 8 hulls, sensors active, helicopters on deck, air defense radars turning. They weren't there to attack the U.S. They were there to ensure no one could rewrite sovereignty with speed. That's when the seizure force understood they had walked into the trap of their own timeline. They had raced to create a fait accompli, and instead they had created a coalition. By 5:42 p.m., the seizure personnel attempted exfiltration, moving toward pre-planned extraction routes over snow and ice, but Arctic terrain punishes haste. Tracks are visible, heat signatures stand out, and ISR doesn't blink. In the next 7 minutes, the remaining hostile control nodes were collapsed. The communications backbone was restored, and the base returned to joint control under an emergency stabilization framework. Decisive didn't mean destructive. It meant final. By 5:55 p.m., the operation was over in the way modern crises end when nobody wants a wider war. Fast, documented, and politically radioactive. The seizure force was contained, disarmed, and extracted from the base's critical areas. The Danish contingent resumed perimeter control with Allied reinforcement overhead. The runway was reopened for emergency flights under strict sequencing. The fuel farm controls were reset. The base's sensors were brought back online, and the air picture stabilized. Quantifiable outcomes mattered here because they anchored reality against propaganda. In this scenario, 1 contested base stabilized, 1 runway obstruction cleared, 6 aircraft returned to service readiness, 14 personnel treated for cold crush injuries, 2 facilities damaged by fire suppression and secondary electrical fires, 8 EU warships repositioned into a deterrent screen, and 0 confirmed fatalities, an outcome that could have gone the other way in under a minute if a single shot had been fired in the wrong corridor. The deeper aftermath wasn't about the runway. It was about trust, because the real weapon used in the first 10 minutes wasn't a rifle. It was ambiguity. The moment the base went silent, everyone assumed the worst. The moment the seizure looked clean, someone somewhere almost believed it was legitimate. And legitimacy is the battlefield no radar can fully cover. But they didn't see the strategic boomerang. The attempt to force Denmark into quiet compliance produced the opposite: EU unity through alarm. 8 warships didn't just sail for Greenland, they sailed for the principle that you can't seize sovereignty by accelerating paperwork into a runway. And just as the situation seemed contained, a final open loop emerged. The North Atlantic had been shown a new vulnerability: how quickly a local base issue can become a multi-flag maritime convergence, with the ocean burned beneath low clouds and the strait narrowed by miscalculation. The lesson is brutal and simple. Overconfidence in a bloodless takeover is the fastest route to a catastrophic mistake, because modern alliances don't need days to respond. They need a gap in the sensor picture and a verified distress call. Once radar lit up and the narrative was intercepted, the seizure force lost the one thing it needed: time. The window closed, the island held, and the response became retaliatory in posture, even when it stayed surgical in action. This fictional scenario ends with restraint, but it doesn't end with comfort, because the next crisis won't start with warships already at sea. It might start with a single aircraft diverting, a single satellite cue, and a single base going silent, until the wrong actor believes they can do in 5 minutes what diplomacy couldn't do in 5 years. Subscribe for the next operations breakdown, because the next time the North Atlantic goes silent, you won't get a warning.